Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Do let me know if you can hear me. Anybody can raise their hand or say something. I see we have a good quorum. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Edward. I see your hand. Thank you, Joy. Thank you so much for joining. We're going to start in 1 minute. So much for joining. And on such a time for your time here, I'm Ashiri, the host for this webinar. However, I'm not a trainer. We have Joseph, our guest, who's going to be doing training for the webinar. This is actually our fourth webinar that we're having now. The first one that we had was on TMDB, had a second one on ITSM. We also had a third one which we hosted ourselves for our software-defined infrastructure services, where we discussed business outcomes, and this is our fourth. I don't want to say final, but this is our fourth one for now. That is managing risk within IT change management, and I will have Joseph walk us through it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And welcome everyone to the fourth series of the NTT Data webinars. And today we have an interesting topic, managing risk within IT change management. And let me take you through, just as an introduction, who we are. I am Joseph Nduhiu. I work for Mwasuki Technologies. We are a consulting team partnering with NTT Data, and we support organizations to adopt international best practices and standards when it comes to IT service management, business processes, agile project management, and cyber resilience. So pleasure to meet you who are attending. At any particular point, you may have a question. Please use the chat feature to be able to type in your question. The structure of the presentation is with 3 parts. At the end of every part, we will check the chat for any questions. And then we will also do some interactive questions at that point. So when it comes to managing risks, first we'll just start off with an understanding of IT change management fundamentals. Then we'll go looking at what are the risks that come when we are in the change management process. And then finally, we will discuss how to mitigate these risks in our IT environment. So let's first start with our fundamentals. All right, so what is a change? There are many definitions, but the textbook one, which comes from the ITIL framework, is the addition, modification, or removal of anything that has a direct or indirect effect of services. So when you talk about anything, most times in our IT environment, we usually think about hardware and software, but when you look at the service environment, the actual reality is our scope can go beyond that. If you make a change on a critical role, like someone who has admin rights or particular skills, then that can have a direct or indirect effect on services. Licenses, integration, change of suppliers or change of environments can also have an effect on services. So we need to consider the whole scope. Obviously, when it comes to making such changes, then it all depends on where the organization is. Changes can happen during business as usual when we are doing routine maintenance or implementing new services, and they can swing all the way through projects. And then we can also go through whenever we have adverse situations, whether we have incidents or even disasters that can also trigger changes. And so when it comes to the process itself, IT change management is the process that is charged with maximizing the number of successful changes to IT services and their components by ensuring risks have been properly assessed, authorizing changes to proceed, and managing the change schedule. So the whole point of the process is the life cycle of changes, from the time we plan them to the time they get approved, the time they are implemented, and the post-implementation views. That process, the key outcomes. What we want to do is to maximize the number of successful changes. So when it comes to success, that means we have to contain the risks and we have to make sure that key stakeholders are involved. And so that's the main outcome we look for when we practice change management. Now, in terms of terminology on use, the terminology has evolved over time. Change management is traditionally the name that the process has, And if you are one who follows, ISO standards, information systems, the terminology used there is change management. Some frameworks use the term change control. ITIL 4, when it was released in 2019, came up with a different term. They used to use change management before, now the focus is change enablement. And the whole point is to push changes quickly and successfully. So regardless of the terminology you use in your organization, what matters is that the planning, the approval, the implementation, and the review is done in a manner that delivers the outcomes that the organization is looking for. Now, most times when you're introduced to IT change management, you usually group changes in different categories. Okay, the traditional grouping of changes is 3 categories. There are other categories, but generally most changes fall into the first 3 main categories. Those are standard changes, normal changes, and emergency changes. Okay, a standard change, this is usually a low risk change. It is usually pre-authorized. It is relatively common and follows a known procedure. Most times in a well-working environment, you'll find standard changes have been formally defined. People know this is a standard change and the procedure has been documented and has gone through an approval. So at the particular time that that change is logged and classified as a standard change, we already know the steps that will be followed. We already know that this has been done before and has been approved, and we already know that this is low risk. Anything that does not fall in that category then becomes a normal change. So this change, now the level of risk has gone up, and so we must need some investment in assessment and authorization and scheduling. Whenever we fall out of schedule, then we tag the change as an emergency change. Okay, so this is an unscheduled change that must be implemented quickly, and for which, as far as your change management policy is concerned, we can do an expedited approval, so we do not go through the same level of assessment and authorization as a normal change, or we can apply an approval post the change. Approval here means the documented approval. So in emergency changes, you might find a verbal approval is issued, and then the change is implemented, and then later a record is documented, and whoever gave the verbal approval now goes in to document that verbal approval after. Okay, some organizations have different dimensions. Some introduce what we call a latent change that is in a similar way talks about all that approval after the change. But generally, the main 3 changes are these. And so if you're thinking about examples of a standard change, anything like adding a new user, provisioning a new device, or updating software licenses, so long as it is low risk, standard procedure, and has been pre-approved, then you can consider it as a standard change. Normal change, an idea would be a migration of a database. It could be a new network firewall rule. It could be an upgrade to an application. Basically, these are the kind of changes that have a significant risk where it can result in an outage or a degradation. For emergency changes, you'd be thinking about a change that addresses an outage, a corruption, or a security breach. Something that needs to be done quickly, and we cannot wait for scheduling, which is usually the thing that defines a normal change, where we go through some level of scheduling. Okay, now in terms of change management as a process, we recognize that change management does not operate as an independent or a standalone process, but it's part of a service management ecosystem. This is an example of a service management ecosystem. This is by the Universal Service Management Framework. So their process model has 5 processes: agree, change, repair, operate, and improve. And in all those, you can see that change sits at the center, because whenever there is a wish from the business or from the user, then realizing that wish, once an agreement is done between the service provider and the customer, is usually done through a request for change. And so one of the triggers for request for change is usually a customer need or a business need, and the realization comes through a request for change. As we mentioned before, incidents can also trigger a request for change, especially of the emergency kind. Improvements are largely driven as an input towards change, especially when you're talking about things like upgrades and updates. And then in terms of operating services, you might also require a change to operate some particular service requests, especially when you're looking at standard changes. So you must understand that the change process has to be integrated with existing processes that involve onboarding new customer or business requirements, improving service delivery, operating our services, or repairing our systems. Now, in terms of the life cycle, and this process is picked from ITIL 4, changes usually would generally go through 6 phases. One starts with the registration of the change, and this comes from the requester or the planner of the change. And usually a change record is populated that defines the description of the change, that defines the reasons why the change is being implemented, the kind of outcome we expect, and usually the supporting documentation behind that change. Especially for a normal change, the expectation is that when we are registering the change, we would have the procedures in terms of what is going to be executed. We probably have some rollback plan in terms of if the change goes wrong, what's supposed to happen. You might have test results that validate that, you know, this change has been tested, maybe in your development environment, in your staging environment, UAT environment, whatever it is. And so those details are usually submitted during the change registration. In addition, the person requesting the change may also have a expected date in which they want to implement the change. Then the change goes through assessment. Assessment can go through different levels depending on the type of change, but in this particular regard, we are clarifying, you know, what is the impact of the change. We are also checking what is the urgency of the change. We are also checking, is there a conflicting change based on the projected or proposed date of implementation. Once assessment is done, then we move into authorization. Authorization is the decision-making point at which we decide, do we proceed with the change or not? If the change is not authorized for one reason or another, then we skip the next steps and then we go straight through to closure. If the change is implemented, then we plan for the execution of the change. In this regard, we communicate to key stakeholders the planned date of the change. We get alignment with impacted service owners so that they understand that the change will happen. Any team that involved in monitoring and testing, they are all aligned in terms of this is the target change date. And then the change is realized. And when the change is realized, this is the execution and the control part where we monitor to make sure that the change was implemented. And then if the change is not going well, then we implement our rollback or backout plans. And then finally, we go into change review where we go back and check what were the original goals of this change. How did we meet them? Did the change result in adverse effects? Then we also do that review, and we might generate a change review report if required. So generally, those are the steps. Now, depending on the category of change or your particular environment, then now this flow might change in terms of the amount of steps you might need, but generally a change process would follow these particular steps. Now, in terms of impact and assessment, in terms of assessment of changes, generally, the guidance is usually based on impact and urgency. And so prioritization is based on how urgent the change needs to be implemented and the impact on the organization or the customer base. So anything that is low priority would probably have flexible timing and affect a very small subset of customers. But whenever you're making a change that has a significant number of customers, or you're affecting an entire enterprise and needs to be addressed quickly, then the level of priority is high. So this also goes hand in hand with in terms of risk assessment, because most times when you talk about risk to change, then we are talking about the impact. And so this then informs the level of due diligence that needs to be done on the change and also the business approval levels. So the kind of roles we expect in a change management environment would probably be around three. You'd have the change requester or submitter who submits or populates the initial change request and plays a key role in the planning and all implementation. So you might find a situation where the person requesting is also the person implementing, or the person requesting is doing so on behalf of an implementation group, especially where you find the implementer could be a third party or a cross-functional change that involves different teams participating. Then you get a role of change coordinator or change manager, and this role helps in coordinating the assessment of the changes, plan with key stakeholders. This role may also be responsible for the post-implementation. But is simply any role within the organization that does a formal review and then does either the approval or the decline the change request. The change authority may also be required whenever we need to trigger fallback or invoke the continuity plan whenever a change goes wrong. So those three roles are important to have. Obviously, in an organization, the terminology in terms of the names might be different, but what matters is you make sure that there is clear delineation between who submits and implements the changes, who reviews, assesses, and communicates and schedules the changes, and who approves changes and also makes decisions on fallback or continuity. Of authority level, the main determinant is the category of change, the risk, and the impact. Now, depending on your organization, you might have different levels of approval. You might so at the lowest level, you might find a line manager or a product or system owner or manager who's responsible for implementing the lowest level impact or risk. So whenever, especially when we have standard changes or low risk normal changes, then the level of approvals might be low. The risk hits a certain level or the imp hits a certain level, then the change manager might be involved in terms of the detailed assessment and approval. And for some organizations at a critical level, then you have the change advisory board, especially where there is enterprise-wide impact. And at a textbook level, the change advisory board might be responsible for reviewing and validating that the change should be approved or not approved. So advisory here does not mean approval board. It simply says you have a team that validates what the change has been submitted and then makes the decision that the change should proceed for approval. Then at the highest levels, you will get the steering committee and the business or executive management. This is now the highest impact, highest risk changes where decisions, where this particular change, if it goes wrong, can have material effect on the organization and on customers, and can result even in regulatory penalties. So think about core banking, think about mobile money, think about the core insurance platform, think about telecoms billing system, or those sort of systems where if it goes down, materially the business can lose significant revenue, can result in customer churn, can result in lawsuits, can result in regulator penalties. Then you need the highest level to approve at that particular risk. Now, it's very important for you to understand the authority levels and have them clearly communicated so that we limit a situation where low risk changes go through too many levels of approval. All right, so that is our introduction to the fundamentals of change management. I will next be going into risks in IT change management, but before that, just wanting to find out just from the floor, are there any questions so far? Oh, okay. Not. Okay, so let's do our first webinar question. Oh, I think on the chat I can see what documents are needed in a standard change. So David, thank you for that question. Now, based on my experience, if you are raising a standard change, what matters most is the procedure in terms of the steps you take. So the defined procedure of executing that standard change. And then together with that, an assessment that indicates that this change is low risk and low impact and is a repeatable change. So if you have those two, and then a signature or an approval by the particular service or system owner, those three at a bare minimum should be sufficient documentation when you're logging a standard change. Now, note that a standard change needs to be managed by a change management team, such that if that standard change goes wrong and there is an incident, then we need to cancel that change and then communicate to our stakeholders that until we validate that that change is no longer low risk, then it is removed. So the change manager would maintain a list of pre-approved standard changes so that anytime it is submitted, then it goes through the system. So usually I talk about those three key artifacts. That's the standard procedure in terms of the standard steps for implementing that change, the risk assessment to show that it is low risk, and then the pre-approval for that. Then you maintain that particular record. All right. Bakita asks, is there a difference between a change requester and a change owner? Okay, so that's a good question. Now, you might say that it depends on the context, because for some organizations, the change owner might be the person who's accountable for the success of the change, but the person requesting the change could be a team member who has been assigned that particular role to populate the change request. So the change owner might be, a product manager. It could be a head or a senior manager who's responsible for a particular domain. So maybe a database domain or platform domain or a cloud environment and the like. And so the change owner is the person who will take end-to-end accountability for that particular change, in terms of, when is it being done, who's involved, rollback in place. But the change requester might be the person whose role is simply to populate the change request, appear before the change authority, and present the change and make sure that all the change details as per the documenting of the change is there. So those are the things you might need to consider. So thank you for those two questions. Okay, so for our webinar questions, we are going to go to Mentimeter. We have a code up there, so go to menti.com, and when you go to menti.com, enter the code that is there. And so when you enter the code, please give me a thumbs up to show that you are within the webinar environment. So enter the Mentimeter code that you can see on your screen. Once you enter, give me a thumbs up. Our code is 42934736. So go to menti.com, 42934736. Sorry. Okay, we have 7 so far. How many do I expect? Rough estimate. So we have around 27, 28 attendees. So let's get to 20 likes and then we or 15, halfway. If we can get to halfway, and then we run the quiz, the question. We're at 8 so far. 9. Okay, I think we will start the questions at 10. So we need just one more. Okay, so I want to ask you guys a question based on your environment. So in your IT environment, what's your organization's approach to standard changes? All right. So we have 3 choices there. Pick one. Okay, so all right, so at least we have some responses, okay? So majority says standard change types have been formally defined and are followed. And then we have saying standard changes are understood and applied in an ad hoc manner, okay? So that's good feedback. We will review this as we go along. Okay, so let's then switch to the second part, which is risks in IT change management. Okay, so one of the things that we have to be cognizant of is the environment that we are operating in terms of IT. So especially knowing that how IT is evolving, most enterprise environments are now hybrid, where you have a mix of, your legacy, on-prem, then private cloud, and then public cloud, co-location and the like. And so, and then obviously there's a whole network of integrations. And sometimes we reach a point where, because of the rate of change within the organization and lack of clarity in terms of an understanding of, how our current environment is and what an IT change would do, we usually call that a VUCA environment. VUCA is a term that stands for volatility, uncertainty, ambiguity, and complexity. So the harder it is to predict the outcomes of our changes, and the less likely we understand the impact, then we move away. We then move more towards volatility, more towards complexity, more towards uncertainty within our environment. And that means that IT change management becomes an extremely risky process, especially when we are dealing with normal changes and emergency changes based on the environments we are in. Another way to look at environments is there's a Swedish term, Kunevin, and in Kunevin, we group our environments in four pots, okay? Obvious, complicated, complex, and chaos. Okay, so if you think about a standard change would operate in the obvious domain. And so in the obvious domain, we already have an understanding of what is expected and the level of risk. And so implementing such a standard change is an obvious thing, where we do not expect deviation from the procedure and we do not expect deviation from the impact. So at the obvious domain, this is where we have standard changes. Once we get to normal changes where the level of risk goes up and the complexity of the implementation goes up, then now we go into complicated and complex domains. In complicated domains, we might need to sense the impact, then we do an analysis, and then we respond appropriately. While in a complex domain, you might need to probe, then sense, which means in probing, we might want the particular team that is implementing the change to actually demonstrate to us that this change has been done in another environment, and we've proven that we recognize the risk being involved, or we can run an analysis and determine the level of impact in advance. So a normal change would normally fall around the complicated or complex domain. Now, at the chaos domain, this is now where your emergency change would fall into. This is at the point where we act, and then we sense the impact of that particular emergency change, and then we respond accordingly. So whether we are failing over or whether we are cleaning our systems from, a security attack, we first act and then come back to respond whenever we are populating the change request post in terms of what was actually done and what was the actual impact. Beyond that, now the final domain is disorder. At this point, we are not really operating at, a change management process, so to speak. So a framework like Cunevin can be important for you in terms of an analysis of the risks to your change environment. Now, when you're thinking about risks, always have two perspectives. What is the risk of not doing the change versus the risk of doing the change? Okay, so and this is important because as an organization, you need to understand what is your risk appetite. So risk appetite here is the amount of risk an organization is willing to take on to achieve its goals. And if we are not having a clear understanding of our risk appetite, then it's highly likely that whenever we are assessing changes, then we might refuse or changes which are within our risk appetite, or we might end up accepting changes which are intolerable to the organization. So it's important for you to understand what is our risk tolerance in terms of accepting the changes that are going to be implemented in our environment. Now, the risk of doing nothing is significant to an organization. So if we put obstacles in our change process to restrict changes from happening, then we risk the opportunity cost that comes with a change. So especially for agile organizations, we realize that if we are an agile organization, then by deploying changes quickly, especially changes that are business-centric, then the time to market is reduced, which means the organization can actually result in getting value from that particular change. If we are not agile, then we risk loss of opportunities as an organization. So it's important for you as an organization to make a decision in terms of saying, do we put obstacles towards our change management process, which then means that we miss out on business opportunities, or we risk our environment becoming outdated because we do not implement the upgrades that are required in a timely manner. Okay, so what are the kind of change management practices that hinder change execution and result in risk of not doing something? If you have bureaucratic policies, which then result in either delays or too many hurdles towards a change being implemented, you can have too many cooks where you've defined your approval framework in such a way that implementation teams have to go through a significant level of approvals for a change that might probably be of low risk. Then if we are also operating manual approaches, then we also risk slowing change execution. Then there is the fear of the unknown, especially when it comes to change approvers or change authorities who are hesitant to approve a change because they lack 100% certainty on the impact of the risk, especially where in an environment where failure is frowned upon. So you have a situation where an approver would want you to jump through so many hurdles because they know that if there is a negative impact, then they will be on the chopping board because they'll be asked about why they approved the change. Then obviously with such scenarios, then you get your delayed approvals because of that whole situation where you are afraid of implementing the particular change. Okay, But on the other perspective of the change is then the risk of doing. Okay. You remember the CrowdStrike incident that happened last year because of a configuration update. Okay. That affected Windows devices around the world. And the financial impact is just some crazy numbers. But this is our reality in change management, that especially when you're dealing with critical incidents, when you implement such a change, it can have significant impact on people, on businesses, legal and regulatory repercussions and the like. I came across this other interesting example. You have Uganda Securities Exchange. In 2022, they had a vendor called SoftEdge who are making an upgrade to their KYC system. But unfortunately, this vendor incorrectly configured a firewall. And when that happened, personal information of people who own shares on the Uganda Security Exchange was accessed. And so when the Personal Data Protection Office of Uganda did the investigation, they actually found that this particular vendor, SoftEdge, they did not follow USC's own change management procedures, including communicating when they were implementing the change, and by so doing, they exposed Uganda Stock Exchange and anyone who was registered on that particular KYC platform. So the reality is, when implementing changes, we can either fall foul in terms of bringing systems down, or we can introduce vulnerability, and then this leads us to regulatory penalties. Okay, so when it comes to doing, then the kind of practices that can result in these particular risks would start from poor planning, where the change requester fails to understand the scope, fails to understand the impact, or fails to test adequately, which then could lead to such downtime or vulnerabilities being introduced. The other practice is limited configuration visibility, especially as we operate in very complex IT environments. And so we do not understand exactly, when I touch this database, when I touch this router, when I make changes to this system, what exactly downstream or upstream am I affecting? Same thing applies to manual approaches. If our change procedure is being implemented in a manual manner, chances of errors are likely to happen, which can then result in changes going wrong. If we do inconsistent or rushed assessment, where we fail to consider the exact impact, that can be an issue. Limited stakeholder awareness, where we fail to communicate to key stakeholders about the schedule of the change and the impact of the change. And then as an organization, if there is no rigorous follow-up on the outcomes of the changes, especially related to incidents caused by changes, and then addressing those root causes through problem management, then you would have those particular concerns. So those are the kind of risks we face in IT change management. So our last section is, how do we mitigate those particular risks? So at this point, I'll take a pause if we have a question from the panel, even as we look at our next Mentimeter question. Okay, so back to menti.com. I hope you did not close your browser. You can refresh it. If you did, just go back to menti.com and use the code 42934736. And Our next poll question is asking, what are the most prevalent IT risks, change risks to your organization? So what you can do is try and arrange those in terms of which one happens at the very top, and then the one that happened lowest, you can take it to the bottom. Okay. So if you can see the poll, just move things around in terms of the score. So what out of 100, what would you give to bureaucratic approvals? What would you give to limited visibility? What would you give to rushed change assessment? What would you give to limited automation? What would you give to poor communication? And what would you give to inadequate? As we finish our last topic. Okay, so we are starting to see some feedback. Someone says pure communication could be a big trigger. Then obviously bureaucratic approvals looks to be one of the things. And one of the challenges we have with bureaucratic approvals is that people start to circumvent the change process. So if we have too much bureaucracy, then what happens is people try and mask their change as a standard change, or try to downplay the risk so that it does not go through too many levels of approvals. And that's usually one of the challenges we have, because when that happens, when people start to circumvent the approval process, then it's highly likely that some changes will go through which are of high risk, but have not gone through proper assessment and the like. Okay, good feedback, guys. Thank you. Okay, so finally, how do we mitigate these particular risks? And for my topics, I will usually say, when it comes to managing these risks, we will need to consider all the dimensions of change management. And the 5 dimensions that I have put in place are governance, people, culture, process, and technology. So we have to consider all those domains. So in terms of governance, it's important for us to make sure that our governance framework applies where in a manner that takes cognizance of value and difficulty. And this addresses the issue of bureaucratic approvals. We need to make sure that if something is low value and low difficulty, then we do not subject it to very high levels of oversight. Okay, so especially when we have our standard changes, then the level of governance should be low. It's only when a standard change causes an incident that's when we need to now have take that insight or hindsight into play in terms of making sure that is happening. But then now when we go to more complex changes that are of high value and high risk, then now the level of foresight and oversight comes into play. What does that mean? As an organization, it's very important for you to define what are the approval matrices. And then if a change has been done several times and has not brought issue, then we need to move it downwards in terms of the governance mechanism. So governance, high level of governance should only be attributed wherever we have changes which from history we know have caused incident, or they are novel changes. They are new to our environment, and so we do not have clarity in terms of the level of impact. But once a normal change has been done several times, then we need to start looking at how do we reduce the level of governance, okay, so that we do not introduce bureaucracy. And how do we do that? Then we need to specify this in our change management policy, where we need to have a balance between agility and risk control. So in terms of how our change policy governance directives are applied, then we need to make sure that we have the right level of governance. So what does that mean? In our IT change management policy, we need to clarify what are the change categories that exist in our environment and how each is managed. We need to also provide direction in how to move more normal changes towards standard changes through automation. That means if a normal change has been done repeatedly, then can we make it a standard change? Can we automate it because we now understand the impact that particular change comes in? Then we need to provide clarity on change authority roles, okay? So that we remove or reduce that bureaucracy and facilitate agility. Then it's important for follow-up that we insist on detailed root cause analysis for failed changes, and we track the improvement actions. And then obviously, from a governance perspective, we drive towards that change management actually leads us to effective performance, responsible stewardship, and ethical behavior, which comes into play, especially when you think about culture. In terms of technology controls, it's important for us to have better visibility on our environments. And that means we need to invest in configuration management databases or configuration management systems. All right. We did a webinar on CMDB a while back, basically just saying it's very important to, automatically discover and map your services so that whenever you raise a change and you're saying, I'm touching, this virtual machine or this server, then I understand the impact on dependent services. So it's important for us to invest in a comprehensive population of our CMDB, especially for our critical services, and then develop service maps so that whenever we are evaluating our changes, we actually know what are the dependencies and the relationships within our service components. Another application you can do is to have defined risk assessment questionnaires within your ITSM change management module. This is a screenshot from SMAX. Out of the box, it has a risk assessment questionnaire, which you can apply to a change. And what this does is that the change requester can populate the answers to the questions in terms of impact and urgency, and then you get a risk score. And so this risk score will calculate for you whether this change is high risk, and then routes the changes to the appropriate change authority. So then we do not have to have a CAB asking repeat questions around impact because all the information on the assessment is in the change request. So when we look at the assessment questionnaire, then we can hold the change requester or change owner accountable based on these questions in terms of their understanding of that particular change. For automation, a lot of organizations are moving to, CI/CD, and DevOps, where you have continuous integration, continuous deployment, and continuous delivery. This is just an example of an implementation where automation has been done into the development environment, but then for test environment and production environment, the organization has not yet automated. What this means is that this organization wants to make sure that we do not automatically deploy to production until we get approval. So we will automatically deploy to our development environment, and then only after we have validated our code, then now we can push to other environments. So that's a risk-based approach to automated deployment, where we make sure that we do not automatically deploy to our productions until the point where we validated that the risk has been reduced. Either that change has been done severally, and now we are confident enough to say, let's automate all the way through to production. So that's technology. For people's side, what matters is to make sure that we have defined those roles clearly. And so we need to make sure we define what is the role of the change manager. And here, especially when thinking about enabling, then the change manager's role should not be an obstacle to change, but rather should be seen as a facilitator of change, especially when it comes to defining change models, helping teams progress changes from normal changes to standard changes, communicating to stakeholders, making sure that we invest in well-working CMDBs and the like. So having a change manager role is crucial towards addressing change risks. From skills perspective, we can take advantage of a framework like SFIA, which is the skills for information age. And then we can define what are the skills that we need for change management or change control. So here you will see different skill levels. At the lowest level here, we are just talking about administration of change requests and implementation of low risk changes. Then as the skill level goes higher, then we need expertise in analysis, expertise in configuration management, expertise in planning and in root cause analysis. At level 5, we are now going into leadership in terms of approval, leadership in terms of reviewing the effectiveness of our change implementation. And at the highest level, we are setting the policies of change management, and we are reviewing our risk management framework. So understanding skill levels for the stakeholders involved in change management is important. Then from a process perspective, it's very important for us that we avoid a one-size-fits-all change process model. So it's important for us to develop multiple change models for different types of changes. Hardware changes, software changes, integrations, cloud environment, and the like. Define and build multiple change models that work. And that will help you a lot in addressing the bureaucracy and the hurdles, and it makes it easier for people to appreciate your change process. So basically, the right change model should lead you to the appropriate change authority. So it has to be clear that if I'm implementing this type of change, I have clarity in terms of who should be involved, who should address that, and the change management team should be helping me in this regard. And of course, for processes, it's very important for us to measure the metrics of our processes and report on how well our change management process is doing. These are examples of metrics from ITIL 4, where you're looking at a practice success factor and you're looking at metrics. Very important that we check the turnaround time of realizing changes so that we address the bureaucratic part, but at the same time, we also report on what is the impact of our changes, especially where incidents are concerned. We also check stakeholder satisfaction, especially people who submit change requests. Are they happy with the way their change request is going through the process? And then satisfaction in terms of the success. And then governance, always making sure that we are compliant. Whenever audits are done, that our change models are being followed, the requisite information is in place, the requisite approvals are in place. So that's the compliance. And then finally, having the right mindset. The right mindset should be an agile mindset, the one that looks to progress over perfection. No change environment will have 100% change success rate. If you are an evolving organization, then you need to invest in experimentation, innovation, and adaptation. And that means you have to have a willingness to accept failure, a willingness to accept that changes can go wrong. So what matters is we need to invest in platforms and environments that allow us to fail quickly, reverse changes, and involve as many stakeholders as possible. Some organizations are moving towards leaving bureaucratic structures towards more agile-based organizations where you have end-to-end accountability. And so we have to trust teams that have end-to-end accountability to actually own their changes end-to-end. And the only time we are going to high levels of approval is only when a particular change went wrong, or we're having a novel change which is complex and can have significant impact. So this also would be useful to us. So as a parting shot, it's very important for us to find a balance, the right balance between speed and control in change management. And that is an ongoing exercise. You will never have it perfect. So the important thing is finding the right balance, and that comes through iteration, that comes through trust, that comes through constant review of our processes and our performance to make sure that our change management process is actually fit for purpose and addresses the risks that our environment faces. So our last quiz question, back to Menti, we'll just ask the question. All right, in terms of managing risks, based on what we've just looked at, how would you rank these elements? Okay, so what is important for your organization? Is it people? Is it technology first? Where does culture fit in? As we take any other questions on the chat. Okay, David had a question on that asks, if a standard change is pre-authorized, who really authorizes it as a industry best practice? Yeah. So who really authorizes it? And it will go back to the term that Bakita used, the owners, or who is responsible. Okay. So if a standard change involves a standalone database, then the best authority for that particular change would be, the manager for that DBA. If that particular change falls on, user access for a particular system, then pre-authorization might involve an authorization from the system owner, and then maybe we might want our security team to give us a pre-authorization based on the level of access that is concerned. If it is low-level access, we can pre-authorize, and then if the access is high level, which might expose the organization to a risk, then that now moves into a normal change process. So authorization is based on system ownership or service ownership for purposes of pre-authorization. And then we give that pre-authorization to our change management team, so that whenever that change is logged as a standard request, then our change management team is able to see it based on what was communicated as pre-authorized. And if it's already there, then we do not put in an obstacle. So our change management team just keeps checking a standard change has been pushed in. Is it part of our pre-authorized list? Yes. If not, then we intervene, and by so doing, what we are doing is raising the level of efficiency. So from the survey, it looks like most people say people first and then process. And that's good feedback. All right.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Let me try that again. There's still a bit of an echo. Can you confirm if you can hear me? I hope I'm audible. Lovely. Thank you so much, Joseph, for that extensive coverage on the risk management within IT. I'd also want to thank all the attendees. Thank you so much for your patience. I know we had scheduled an hour, but thank you so much for the 13 extra minutes that you have accorded us. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions or would like to further discuss the subjects that we've covered so far. Note that this is the first webinar that we've had in 2025, but it will definitely not be the last. We still have around 3 to go. So we have webinars every quarter. Be on the lookout for that. With that, I think I just want to say thank you very much for your patience. We look forward to seeing you the next time. Have a good day ahead.
Thank you.
So I have raised